They thought they were royalty. They stood in the grand foyer of a $5 million estate, sipping imported red wine that cost more than my first car, and they looked down their noses at me. Beggars. That was the word my father chose to use. He spat it at me with such profound venom, his face twisted in a sneer of utter disgust, while my own son sat trembling beside me. He called us beggars, taking up space in my sister's magnificent home. My mother had just smirked, raising her crystal glass to toast the supposed generosity of her golden child. The sheer, suffocating irony of it all burned in my throat. They were sitting on velvet chairs I paid for, eating a lavish Thanksgiving feast catered by a company I hired, inside a sprawling mansion that I owned free and clear. My sister, the fake wealth manager they worshipped, was nothing but a bankrupt fraud who had not paid her rent in 14 months. My family pushed me to the edge that night, thinking I was the same broken, invisible girl they had bullied my entire life. They demanded my submission. Instead, they ignited a storm that would wipe their fake empire off the map by sunrise. What happened next was the most devastating, calculated eviction our pretentious suburb had ever witnessed. My name is Rowena. I am 33 years old, and until that freezing November evening, I allowed my family to use me as a doormat just to keep the peace. The dining room of the estate was a masterpiece of modern luxury, bathed in the warm, golden glow of an intricate crystal chandelier. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a manicured lawn and a private lake that shimmered under the moonlight. The table itself was a massive slab of polished mahogany, currently groaning under the weight of roasted turkey, truffle mashed potatoes, and silver platters of expensive vegetables. It looked like a photograph from a high-end lifestyle magazine. It was gorgeous, breathtaking, and entirely soulless. I sat near the far end of the long table, purposefully keeping a large distance between myself and the center of attention. Beside me was my 7-year-old son, Ronan. He was happily eating his dinner, his small hands carefully holding his fork, wonderfully unaware of the thick, toxic tension that always poisoned our family holidays. Across from me sat my younger sister, Maeve. At 30 years old, Maeve was the undisputed golden child of the family. She wore a custom-tailored blazer, even to a family dinner, her posture oozing a level of unearned arrogance that set my teeth on edge. At the head of the table sat my father, Alistair. He was a man who measured human worth strictly by zip codes, luxury car brands, and country club memberships. My mother, Beatrix, sat immediately to his right. Her posture was rigid, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the room to ensure everything met her exacting standards. For the first hour of the holiday dinner, I focused solely on Ronan. I kept my head down, cutting his food and offering non-committal hums whenever my parents directed a passive-aggressive comment my way. I had learned long ago that invisibility was the safest strategy when dealing with Alistair and Beatrix. The conversation, as always, revolved around Maeve and her supposed brilliance. My father raised his glass of dark red wine, offering a grandiose toast. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, Maeve," Alistair declared, his deep voice booming across the spacious room. "Providing this magnificent home for us. Taking care of your parents in their golden years. It shows exceptional character. You are a true titan of industry." Maeve accepted the lavish praise with a modest nod that I knew was thoroughly fake. She swirled the wine in her glass, leaning back in her upholstered chair with the casual confidence of a queen surveying her conquered lands. "It is my pleasure, Dad," Maeve replied smoothly, a practiced smile on her face. "You and Mom deserve the best. I am happy to share my hard-earned success with the family." My mother placed a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, her diamond rings catching the light. "You have always been so generous, Maeve," she cooed, her voice thick with exaggerated maternal pride. "Not everyone would be so willing to take on such heavy financial responsibilities, especially when others in this room contribute nothing to our well-being." I felt the familiar sharp sting of her insult, but I kept my face blank. I reached over and gently wiped a crumb from Ronan's cheek, pretending I had not heard her cruel remark. This was their favorite game. They love to use Maeve's fabricated success as a blunt weapon to remind me of my supposed failures. In their eyes, I was just the struggling, pathetic single mother who had ruined her life at 26. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about to their wealthy friends. I was the burden they graciously allowed to exist in their shadow, permitted to stay in the modest guest house tucked away in the backyard. Beatrix looked pointedly at my plain, comfortable sweater, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "You know, Rowena," she sighed theatrically, "Maeve works unbelievable hours managing high-net-worth portfolios just to keep a roof over your head. The least you could do is dress appropriately when she hosts us in her main dining room. You look like you just rolled out of bed." I took a slow sip of my water. "I am comfortable, Mom. It is just family." "It is about respect," Alistair snapped, pointing his fork at me. "Something you severely lack. Your sister secured the lease on this $4 million property. She convinced the corporate landlord to let you crash in the guest house because she took pity on your situation. You should be down on your knees thanking her." I looked over at Maeve. She did not defend me. She did not ask our father to lower his voice. Instead, she just sat there and smirked, a smug, self-satisfied expression that grated horribly against my nerves. She took another slow sip of her expensive wine, clearly relishing the moment of my humiliation. I kept my head down, focusing on Ronan. They thought my silence was submission. They had no idea it was a countdown. The tension in the room grew thicker and more unbearable as the dinner progressed. My parents became increasingly emboldened by the wine they were drinking. Their subtle digs transformed into direct, unavoidable insults. They picked apart my parenting, my lack of a traditional husband, and my supposed inability to hold down a real corporate job. Ronan, sensing the negative change in atmosphere, shifted nervously in his heavy wooden chair. He reached for his cup, but his small fingers slipped. The glass tipped over, spilling a small puddle of apple juice onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. It was a minor accident. The kind of harmless thing a 7-year-old boy does every single day. But in this house, under the watchful, critical eyes of my parents, it was a spark hitting a powder keg. "Watch what you are doing." Alistair roared instantly, his voice sharp, loud, and aggressive. "This is an incredibly expensive dining set." I immediately grabbed my cloth napkin to soak up the spill, moving quickly to shield my son from his grandfather's sudden wrath. "It is fine, Dad," I said calmly, dabbing at the wet spot. "I have got it. It was just a small accident." Alistair slammed his heavy hand down on the solid mahogany table. The silverware rattled loudly against the fine china. Ronan physically jumped in his seat, his small eyes widening with genuine fear. He shrank back against my side, his lower lip trembling. "No, it is not fine," my father shouted, his face reddening as he glared directly at me. "This is exactly what I am talking about. You have zero respect for nice things because you have never had to work hard to earn them." The sudden violent outburst echoed loudly in the large dining room. I stopped wiping the table. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. Beatrix leaned back in her chair, lifting her wine glass to her lips with a deeply satisfied smirk. She was thoroughly enjoying the show, happy to see me being put in my place. She turned to Maeve and smiled brightly, openly cheering for her golden child while I was being degraded. "Thank goodness we have Maeve," she whispered loudly. Alistair leaned forward, pointing his finger right in my face. "You and your Brat are just beggars," he sneered, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "You sit here eating the expensive food Maeve paid for, living on the luxury property Maeve leased for us, taking advantage of your successful sister's endless charity. You contribute nothing to this family, Rowena. Nothing. You are a parasite." I looked at Maeve again. She adjusted the cuffs of her designer blazer and let out a soft, mocking chuckle. "Dad is right, Rowena," she said, her voice dropping into a pompous register. "You need a reality check. I allow you to stay on this property. Do not push me, or I will make one phone call to the property management company and have you and your kid thrown out on the street by morning. Try finding an apartment with your pathetic income." The silence that followed their threats felt toxic and suffocating. Any normal person might have cried. 5 years ago, when I was younger and more vulnerable, I might have apologized for taking up space. I might have begged for their forgiveness. But I was no longer the frightened, insecure girl they thought I was. The mother in me rose up, fierce and unforgiving. They had crossed the line the second they terrified my son and called him a beggar. I felt my heart steady in my chest. I recognized that this was the definitive end of my tolerance. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I turned my attention entirely to my son, picked up a clean cloth napkin, and gently wiped his mouth. I offered him a soft, reassuring smile, letting him know without words that he was safe. Then I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up. The scraping of the chair legs against the hardwood floor sounded remarkably loud in the dead, quiet room. I looked down the length of the long table, making deliberate, unwavering eye contact with my mother, then my sister, and finally my father. I let the silence stretch for several long seconds, ensuring I had their undivided attention before I spoke. My voice, when I finally broke the silence, was quiet, perfectly steady, and devoid of any emotion. "You have exactly 12 hours to leave," I stated. For a split second, nobody at the table moved. Then, my father let out a loud, booming laugh that bounced off the walls. My mother joined in, her high-pitched, mocking giggles filling the elegant space. Maeve shook her head, looking at me as if I had lost my grip on reality. They thought it was the funniest, most pathetic thing they had ever heard. The empty, desperate threat of a delusional single mother who had forgotten her lowly place in the family hierarchy. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to crumble. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, forced to swallow their insults just to keep the peace, pay close attention. Because what I did next is for every single one of us who ever had to endure their toxic abuse. 12 hours, I repeated softly, grabbing Ronan's hand. I turned my back on them and walked out of the main house into the freezing night. Behind me, I could hear their laughter resuming, oblivious to their reality. They laughed until their faces turned red. But tomorrow morning, the only color left on their faces would be dead, ash gray. The bitter November wind whipped my hair around my face as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward the beautifully renovated guest house tucked near the edge of the woods. The cold air felt cleansing against my skin. I squeezed Ronan's hand gently as we walked up the steps to our front door. I unlocked it and let the warmth of our home wash over us. Once inside the guest house, the heavy atmosphere of the main estate melted away. This space was mine. I gently helped Ronan off with his heavy winter coat. He was very quiet, his young mind trying to process the angry voices he had just witnessed. I knelt down to his eye level, smoothing his dark hair back. I told him he did a great job at dinner and that his grandfather was just having a grumpy night. I kept my voice light and reassuring. He nodded, wrapping his small arms around my neck for a quick hug before running off to his bedroom. I did not shed a single tear as I watched him go down the hall. I went into his room, tucked him securely into his bed, and read him a story about dragons until his chest rose and fell in a deep, peaceful rhythm. Once I was certain he was asleep and feeling safe, I gently closed his door and walked down the short hallway to my home office. My office was a sharp contrast to the lavish decor of the main house. It was minimalist, highly functional, and equipped with top-tier technology. A massive curved monitor sat on a sleek standing desk. This room was the silent command center where I had built my life from the ground up. I did not go to my computer first. Instead, I turned my attention to the heavy steel wall safe bolted securely behind a framed print of the Chicago skyline. I spun the combination dial, inputting the sequence with practiced ease, and pulled the heavy metal door open. Inside rested what I privately called my museum of pain. I pulled out a worn, cheap plastic laptop. It was heavily scratched, and the battery barely held a charge anymore. This was the exact machine I used when I was 26 years old. When I found out I was pregnant, my parents demanded I give the child up for adoption to save their country club reputation. When I refused, they threw me out of their house with nothing but a suitcase and this cheap laptop. They cut me off financially and emotionally, leaving me to rot. I set the laptop on the desk and reached back into the safe. I pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was an email from Maeve, dated 5 years ago. I had reached out to her, asking for a tiny loan to help cover Ronan's medical bills when he had a severe fever. Her response was burned into my memory. I am not funding your mistakes, Rowena. Maybe if you stopped playing around with your child's play coding projects and got a real job at a diner, you wouldn't be begging. Grow up. She called my work child's play. She refused to lend me $200 to help her sick nephew, all while she was leasing a luxury sports car to impress her friends. Finally, I reached into the back of the safe and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. I flipped it open to the center pages. The crisp white paper was filled with neat handwritten columns of numbers, a stark visual representation of everything I had achieved while my family ignored me. My finger traced the entry from exactly 26 months ago. A massive 8-figure deposit. My parents thought I was a college dropout and a pathetic failure. They had no idea that the logistics software patch I developed on that cheap laptop had revolutionized supply chain management. They did not know that a massive tech conglomerate had bought my proprietary software in a complete buyout, paying me tens of millions of dollars entirely in cash. I secured my future and Ronan's future before I even turned 32. I wanted to put down roots in a quiet, safe community with excellent schools for my son. I found this sprawling estate sitting quietly on the market and purchased it through a corporate entity to maintain my privacy. I sat down at my desk and opened my secure browser. I navigated to a private administrative portal. I typed in my complex master password. A clean, dark-themed dashboard loaded, displaying a gold logo in the top left corner. The text read Apex Holdings, LLC. I navigated to the Property Management tab and clicked on the file labeled Residential Assets. There it was. The sprawling $5 million estate my family was currently treating as their personal kingdom. The property deed was scanned and attached, listing Apex Holdings, LLC as the sole owner. And I was the sole proprietor and CEO of Apex Holdings. I bought this entire property outright, completely debt-free. It was supposed to be a safe place for me and Ronan to live in the guest house, while the main house appreciated in value over time. I clicked on the tenant ledger linked to the main house. Maeve's name sat at the very top of the commercial lease agreement. The numbers on the screen were glaring and undeniable. My sister thought she was the queen of a faceless corporate castle. She didn't realize the executioner was living in her backyard. I stared at the tenant ledger, feeling a profound sense of disgust. The ink on the screen was a solid, unbroken column of red zeros extending down the page. To understand how my sister ended up holding a lease on my property, you have to go back 2 years. It happened right after the acquisition of my software company went public in elite financial circles. I was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, making arrangements to purchase the estate through Apex Holdings. I wanted to move our parents into the main house and take the guest house for myself, envisioning a peaceful arrangement where they could enjoy retirement without knowing my wealth. Anonymity was my shield against their endless greed. Then came the evening Maeve showed up at my apartment door unannounced. I opened the door to find the golden child completely unraveling. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her makeup was smeared with tears, and her face was pale with sheer terror. She pushed her way inside before I could ask what was wrong. She paced my living room like a trapped animal, gasping for air. In her desperate scramble to find a lifeline for her collapsing finances, she had been digging through elite real estate transactions to find a wealthy client to pitch an investment to. She tracked the Apex Holdings registration back to my legal representation. She knew I had cash. She knew I was closing on the massive estate. Maeve collapsed onto my cheap sofa and confessed everything in a torrent of ugly sobs. She was not a successful wealth manager. She had leveraged everything she owned on high-risk investments that had tanked horribly. She was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Her cars were facing repossession. Worst of all, she knew our parents expected her to provide for them. They had spent their lives bragging about her to their country club friends, setting an impossible standard that she desperately tried to maintain with smoke and mirrors. She begged me to save her. She pleaded to let her sign a lease with the LLC, to let her tell our parents she secured this magnificent property for their retirement. She argued that if our parents found out she was a fraud, it would kill our father. She swore that if I let her be the face of this arrangement, she would work day and night to pay the heavily discounted rent. She promised she would protect me and ensure our parents treated me well. I agreed to her desperate proposal, but laid down ironclad rules. She signed a formal, legally binding commercial lease with Apex Holdings. She would pay a heavily discounted monthly rate, just enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance. She also signed a strict non-disclosure agreement. For the first few months, she was grateful. She paid rent on time. But as time went on, the reality of her situation warped her mind. The more our parents praised her for her incredible generosity, the more she believed her own lie. She started walking around the estate like she genuinely owned it. Her gratitude curdled into toxic resentment. When her financial reality caught up with her again, she stopped paying the rent entirely. I looked at the ledger on my monitor. Month 4 was a missed payment. Month 5 brought a frantic text message claiming a temporary cash flow issue. Month 6 was radio silence. By month 8, I had to formally request payment through my anonymous property manager. Maeve had responded with extreme hostility, threatening the manager. Now, we were sitting at exactly 14 months of total delinquency. She owed Apex Holdings tens of thousands of dollars in back rent and late fees. But it was not just the unpaid rent that fueled my anger tonight. Last week, my property manager had forwarded me an alert. Maeve had attempted to use the address of the main estate as collateral to secure a massive, high-interest loan from a very shady private lending firm. She tried to leverage a property she did not own to pay off her mounting debts. It was an act of sheer, desperate criminality. She was a rot festering inside my home. I ran my hand over the mouse, my anger crystallizing into pure, calculated focus. It was not about the money. I had more than enough wealth to sustain my family for generations. It was about the unadulterated disrespect. Maeve was living in a mansion I owned, eating food prepared in a kitchen I paid for, and entertaining our parents in a dining room that belonged legally to me. Yet, she had the audacity to stand there tonight and allow our father to call my son a beggar. She had smiled while he screamed at me. She had pointed her finger at my face and threatened to throw me out onto the street. I gave her a shield to hide her failures, and she sharpened it into a blade to cut me. Now I was going to break the blade. I opened a new document template linked directly to my property management software. I began filling in the official fields for a notice of immediate lease termination. I typed in Maeve's full legal name, the address of the main house, and listed the exact amount of back rent she owed to Apex Holdings LLC. I scrolled down to the legal provisions section. Because she was so eager to show off 2 years ago, Maeve had blindly signed a strict breach of contract clause. It stated clearly that if the tenant fell more than 90 days behind on payments and exhibited hostile behavior toward the property owner or its representatives, the landlord had the right to terminate the lease with a 12-hour emergency eviction notice. She handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her fake empire. I cited the specific clause regarding hostile behavior, vividly recalling the feeling of my father screaming in my face while Maeve laughed. Every keystroke felt like a heavy chain snapping off my shoulders. I was no longer the helpless victim of their endless emotional abuse. I reviewed the digital document one last time, ensuring every legal requirement was met. The wording was cold, formal, and unforgiving. I attached the secure digital signature of the LLC manager. Then I moved my cursor over to the automated dispatch system. This highly efficient system would instantly alert my retained property management firm and generate the physical documents required for immediate law enforcement support. I looked at the glowing digital clock in the top corner of my screen. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. 12 hours from my verbal warning at the dinner table would be noon tomorrow. Right in the middle of the pretentious post-holiday brunch my parents had planned. I clicked the final button to execute the protocol. A green confirmation banner flashed across the top of my monitor. The countdown timer was officially initiated. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind howling outside. I was just about to brew a cup of herbal tea when a heavy, aggressive thud echoed from the front of the house. A second later, a series of violent pounds struck my solid wood front door. I moved silently across the cherrywood floor toward the entryway. The bright porch light illuminated the dark silhouette of a figure swaying slightly on the other side of the frosted glass panels. It was Maeve. "Open the door, Rowena," she demanded, her voice heavily slurred. I stood in the dark entryway, making no move to unlock the deadbolt. I could hear her heavy, uneven breathing. She had spent the hours since my departure consuming a significant portion of my expensive wine collection. I stepped closer to the door, keeping my voice low so I would not wake Ronan. "Go back to the main house, Maeve," I said firmly. "It is 1 a.m. You are making a fool of yourself." My calm tone only infuriated her further. She slapped her palm against the glass. "I am not making a fool of myself," she shouted. "You humiliated me in front of Mom and Dad tonight. You stood up at my dining table and acted like you had some sort of authority. You disrespected me, and I am not going to let that slide." I stared at the blurred outline of her face. "Your dining table?" I repeated softly. "Yes, my house," she snapped back. "I pay for this place. I provide for this family. You are just a charity case taking up space in my backyard. You have zero power here. I am the one with the lease. I could make one phone call right now and have the property manager throw you and your brat onto the street. Enjoy your last night of charity." I listened to her drunken rant, feeling an overwhelming wave of validation. Any lingering shred of guilt I might have harbored about tearing her life apart vanished in that exact moment. I did not try to correct her massive misunderstanding of the situation. I simply turned around, walked back down the hallway to my home office, and woke the high-resolution laser printer from sleep mode. I pulled up the official notice of immediate lease termination I had just generated. I hit print. The machine whirred to life. It spat out 3 crisp pages of legal documentation, printed on official watermarked paper used specifically by Apex Holdings. I gathered the warm sheets, aligned them perfectly, and grabbed a heavy brass paperclip to bind them together. I walked back to the front door. Maeve was still muttering insults on the porch. "Maeve," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy oak door. "Look down at your feet." I knelt on the hardwood floor and pushed the thick stack of watermarked documents through the wide mail slot at the bottom of the door. The paperclip scraped softly against the metal flap as the papers slid through and landed outside. I heard her grunt in confusion as she stumbled back. "What is this garbage?" she slurred. I waited in the dark as she held the papers up to the dim light of the porch fixture. I heard the crisp pages flipping. I gave her a minute to process the bold legal headings, the financial ledger showing her massive delinquency, and the glaring 12-hour countdown timestamp printed clearly at the top. I expected panic. Instead, what I heard next solidified her fate. Maeve started to laugh. It was a deep, roaring chuckle of genuine amusement. "Oh, this is rich," she said loudly, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is truly pathetic, Rowena. You went back into your little office, fired up your cheap laptop, and typed up a fake eviction notice to scare me? You printed a fake document from the landlord? You are out of your mind." She laughed harder. "Did you honestly think I would fall for this desperate stunt? You are delusional and jealous of my success." I kept my hands resting calmly by my sides. "If you believe it is fake, Maeve, then you have nothing to worry about," I said evenly. "Go back to the main house. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day for you." Maeve scoffed a wet, dismissive sound. "You are pathetic," she sneered, tossing the documents back onto the porch floor. "Clean up your own garbage tomorrow morning. I am calling the management company to have you permanently removed." I listened to the heavy sound of her expensive shoes stomping down the wooden porch steps. I watched her shadowy figure stumble away, confident in her fabricated supremacy. She stomped back to the mansion, entirely oblivious that the ground beneath her expensive heels had already vanished. The sun broke through heavy gray clouds just after 7 in the morning. I had barely slept, fueled by adrenaline and cold anticipation, but my mind felt remarkably clear. By 10 o'clock, the tranquil silence of the estate was shattered by the arrival of my parents' highly anticipated post-holiday brunch. They had planned this event for weeks, eager to parade their elite status in front of the most influential residents of our wealthy suburb. From the bay window of my home office, I had a clear view of the main driveway and the sprawling stone patio. A valet service parked the steady stream of luxury SUVs rolling through the front gates. The catering company had set up a massive outdoor mimosa bar and a carving station under heated white tents. It was a flawless display of wealth, funded entirely by credit cards they could not afford and anchored by a house they did not own. My mother, Beatrix, emerged onto the back patio wearing a stunning cashmere sweater and a string of pearls. She floated from group to group with a practiced smile, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She was in her element. My father, Alistair, stood near the massive outdoor stone fireplace, surrounded by a captive audience of local business owners. He held a premium cigar in one hand and gestured expansively at the property. "It is quite the property," Alistair boasted, his deep voice carrying easily across the grass. 3 acres of prime real estate. Maeve practically stole it when she negotiated the lease. The owner is some faceless corporate entity that did not know the true value of the land. But my daughter has a brilliant eye for these things. A chorus of polite murmurs rose from his audience. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction. My father was bragging about stealing my property, oblivious to the fact that the faceless corporate entity was watching him from the guest house window. Then Maeve stepped out through the massive French doors. She looked fully recovered from her drunken tantrum, sporting a crisp designer blazer. She moved through the crowd with the smooth charm of a seasoned politician. I watched her approach Mrs. Cressida, the notoriously judgmental president of the local homeowners association. Beatrix had spent years desperately trying to win her approval. "We just wanted to create a space that reflects our family values," Maeve said smoothly to the older woman. "Success is meaningless if you cannot share it with the people who raised you. I told my parents they will never have to worry about a single thing. This estate is just a small token of my appreciation." Mrs. Cressida placed a hand over her heart, looking at my mother with envy. "Beatrix, you must be so proud," she gushed loudly. "To raise a daughter who is not only a financial genius, but so devoted to her family. Most children are just a drain on their parents' resources." My mother beamed, linking her arm affectionately through Maeve's. "We are incredibly blessed, Cressida. Maeve has always been our shining star. She carries the weight of this family without a single complaint." I leaned against the cool window frame, shaking my head at the absurdity of the performance. The shining star of the family was currently sitting on exactly 14 months of unpaid rent. She was standing on a mountain of fraud, smiling for her adoring audience while the clock ticked mercilessly down toward her total destruction. I glanced down at my watch. It was exactly 10:15. The 12-hour eviction notice I had slid under her door the night before was counting down the final minutes. I stepped away from the window and walked into the living room where Ronan was sitting on the rug, building a tower out of plastic blocks. I crouched down next to him and handed him a blue block. "Are we still going on our adventure today, Mommy?" he asked, his eyes shining brightly. I had promised him a trip to his favorite indoor water park, a perfect excuse to get him off the property before the chaos erupted. He did not need to see his grandfather screaming or his aunt escorted away by security. "Yes, sweetie," I replied softly, smoothing his hair. "We are going to have a wonderful day. Just let Mommy make a few quick phone calls." I walked back into my office and picked up my cell phone. I dialed the direct number for my lead property manager, a tough, no-nonsense woman named Talia, who had handled my corporate accounts for years. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Rowena. We have received the expedited eviction notice for the main house property. The paperwork has been fully processed and filed with the local authorities. Are we on schedule for noon?" "We are perfectly on schedule," I confirmed, keeping my voice steady. "I have 2 security vehicles standing by just down the road," Talia stated. I also coordinated with the local sheriff's department. A deputy will be accompanying us to ensure there is no breach of the peace. They are fully briefed on the situation. "Make sure you approach the main house exactly at noon," I instructed. "Do not wait for the brunch to end. They need to be removed immediately. The breach of contract is absolute, and I want them off my property without delay." "Understood," Talia replied smoothly. We will execute the protocol by the book. They will be given exactly 1 hour to gather their essential belongings under strict security supervision, and then they will be escorted off the premises. I hung up the phone. The trap was firmly set. The local authorities were properly notified, and the execution team was ready. I walked into my bedroom to prepare. If I was going to face my family as the true owner of this estate, I needed to shed the image of the helpless daughter they had forced upon me. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the faded casual jeans and oversized sweaters I normally wore. I reached for the protective armor I reserved for high-stakes corporate negotiations. I pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal gray blazer and matching trousers. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and my most intimidating black heels. As I buttoned the blazer, I felt a physical shift in my posture. My spine straightened. My shoulders pulled back tightly. I was no longer Rowena the disappointment. I was Rowena, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. I applied my makeup with the same cold precision I applied to my code, focusing on sharp, clean lines that projected unyielding authority. I walked back to my desk to make one final call to Gideon, my lead corporate attorney. I needed to ensure the legal fallout was contained before Maeve even realized what was happening. Good morning, Rowena, Gideon said calmly. The 12-hour eviction notice is set to be executed at exactly noon today, I said. My family is currently hosting a large brunch on the property, so the removal process is going to be highly public and incredibly hostile. I need your team on high alert. I have the entire file open on my desk, Gideon replied smoothly. We have the signed lease agreement, the digital logs proving 14 months of non-payment, and the breach of contract clause highlighted. If your sister attempts to file an emergency injunction, my team will block it instantly. She has zero legal standing to remain on the property. Bring in the forensic accounting team, I instructed. I want a complete audit of her entire business structure. I need to know whose money she is losing and how she keeps her fake lifestyle afloat. Consider it done, Gideon affirmed. Stay safe today, Rowena. I ended the call and walked out to the living room. Lauren, my trusted nanny, arrived right on time. I helped Ronan pack his backpack and buckled him into Lauren's car at the rear service gate, out of sight of the brunch. Take your time today, I told Lauren sincerely. Get him dinner and ice cream afterward. I will cover all the expenses. I watched her car pull away until it disappeared down the street. My son was safe, happy, and entirely removed from the upcoming battlefield. I walked back into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a sleek black leather presentation folder. Inside rested the property deed, the LLC incorporation papers, and the legal documents proving my ownership of the estate. I looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was 11:15 in the morning. I had exactly 45 minutes left to wait. 45 minutes until the carefully constructed lies my family built their identities upon were burned to the ground. I grabbed the black leather folder containing the property deed. The clock on the wall struck exactly 12. Showtime. At exactly 11:55, the silence in my home office finally broke. A soft chime from my cell phone signaled a text message from Talia. It was a simple, one-line confirmation stating that the security detail and the local sheriff deputy were pulling onto the main road leading to the estate gates. They were 5 minutes away. I took a deep, steadying breath and stood up from my desk. I picked up the heavy black leather presentation folder containing the property deed and the LLC incorporation papers. The smooth leather felt cool and substantial against my palms. It was the physical manifestation of every late night, every rejected loan application, every moment of doubt I had ever pushed through. I tucked the folder securely under my left arm and walked out of my office. I moved through the quiet, empty guest house, my heels clicking softly against the cherrywood floors. I paused at the entryway mirror for one final check. The woman looking back at me was composed, sharp, and entirely unbothered. I reached for the brass handle of the front door and stepped out into the crisp, biting November air. The contrast between the serene quiet of my guest house and the bustling noise of the main patio was immediate and jarring. The catering staff was weaving expertly through the crowds of wealthy suburbanites, carrying silver trays loaded with smoked salmon canapés and crystal flutes of expensive champagne. Soft jazz music played from the hidden outdoor speakers I had installed the previous summer. The heated white tents glowed warmly against the overcast gray sky, creating an artificial bubble of comfort for my parents and their oblivious friends. I began to walk slowly across the sprawling manicured lawn. I did not rush. I took my time, feeling the soft give of the expensive grass beneath the sharp points of my heels. With every step I took toward the main house, I felt a heavy, suffocating layer of my past falling away. I was shedding the identity of the family disappointment, shedding the role of the charity case, shedding the pathetic narrative they had forced me to wear for 7 years. I was walking across my own land, approaching my own house, preparing to reclaim my own life. As I drew closer to the edge of the stone patio, I noticed that the crowd was clustered heavily around the outdoor fireplace. My mother, Beatrix, was holding court with a group of women draped in designer winter wear. Mrs. Cressida, the Homeowners Association president, was standing right beside her, nodding vigorously at whatever story my mother was spinning. I stopped near the edge of the catering tent, remaining perfectly still as I observed them. I wanted to soak in this final moment of their grand illusion. Maeve was standing a few yards away, laughing loudly with a local real estate developer, projecting the image of a titan of industry. My father, Alistair, was near the outdoor bar, signaling the bartender for another pour of top-shelf bourbon. They were entirely intoxicated by their own fake status, thoroughly convinced that they ruled this little corner of the world. It took exactly 2 minutes for my mother to notice me. She had been gesturing broadly with her champagne flute when her sharp eyes locked onto my figure standing near the tent. The easy, practiced smile on her face vanished instantly. Her posture went rigid. I saw her eyes dart up and down, taking in my tailored charcoal gray suit, my crisp white silk blouse, and my professional demeanor. This was not the oversized sweater and faded jeans she was accustomed to seeing me wear. This was a direct threat to the narrative she had carefully constructed for her friends. I did not look away. I held her gaze with unwavering calm. Beatrix quickly turned back to Mrs. Cressida, but her voice immediately rose in volume. It was a deliberate, calculated shift in tone designed to ensure that everyone in their immediate circle, and especially me, could hear every single word. She plastered a deeply sympathetic, patronizing look on her face. "I do apologize for the interruption, Cressida," my mother sighed loudly, projecting her voice across the patio. "But it seems my daughter has decided to wander out of the guest house. She has always struggled so much with boundaries. You know how difficult it can be with children who simply refuse to launch. We try to give Rowena as much grace as possible considering her unfortunate situation. But sometimes her lack of social awareness is just exhausting." Mrs. Cressida turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a sickening mixture of pity and judgment. "Oh, Beatrix, you are practically a saint," she cooed, shaking her head sadly. "I simply do not know how you and Alistair manage the stress. It must be so incredibly draining to have a grown child still clinging to your apron strings. Especially when you have a daughter as remarkably successful and independent as Maeve. You provide her with a free roof over her head, and she repays you by loitering around your private events." "We do our best, Cressida. We really do," my mother nodded tragically, taking another sip of her champagne. "We convinced Maeve to let her stay in the back property out of pure charity. We keep hoping that being around our successful friends might finally inspire her to do something meaningful with her life. But some people are just perfectly content to live off the hard work of their betters." I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the leather folder tucked under my arm. The sheer venom in her words was astounding. Yet it did not hurt me. For the first time in my life, her cruel public humiliation felt hollow. It was nothing more than the desperate flailing of a woman who had built her entire identity on a throne of lies. The sound of my mother's raised theatrical voice had drawn the attention of my father. Alistair turned away from the outdoor bar, his heavy brow furrowing in deep annoyance as he spotted me standing near the edge of his pristine gathering. He marched across the stone patio, his heavy footsteps thudding against the expensive pavers. He pushed his way past a group of chatting neighbors, not bothering to offer polite excuses. His face was flushing a deep, angry shade of red. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, using his physical size to try and intimidate me into submission. "What exactly do you think you are doing out here, Rowena?" my father demanded, his voice a harsh, aggressive whisper meant only for my ears. "We have important guests. We are entertaining people who actually matter in this community. You have zero business being on this patio dressed up like you belong here. You are going to ruin this entire brunch with your pathetic presence." I looked up at him, my expression neutral. "I am simply enjoying the fresh air, Alistair," I replied smoothly. "It is a beautiful day for a walk around the estate." His eyes widened in shock at my use of his first name. I had never addressed him so casually, so disrespectfully in my entire life. His jaw clenched, and the veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. He leaned in closer, trying to force me to back down. "Do not play games with me," he hissed viciously. "I do not care what you think you are doing, but it ends right now. Turn around, walk back to that guest house, and lock the door behind you. You are embarrassing your mother. You are embarrassing your sister. And you are embarrassing me. Go back inside and stay out of sight before I have Maeve call the property manager to drag you off this land." I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch, and I did not break eye contact. I slowly lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the sleek minimalist face of my watch. The silver second hand swept methodically across the black dial. I watched it move with pure focus. 5 seconds. 4 seconds. 3 seconds. I looked back up at my father, staring him dead in the eye with a cold, unwavering intensity that made him momentarily falter. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and electric. The ambient noise of the brunch seemed to fade entirely into the background. "It is exactly 12 o'clock, I said softly. Before Alistair could even open his mouth to demand what I was talking about, the heavy wrought iron front gates of the estate began to slowly swing open. The mechanical groan of the expensive motors echoed across the front drive, cutting through the jazz music playing on the patio speakers. The distant, heavy crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of the execution team. The time for warnings was over. 2 massive, heavily tinted, blacked-out luxury SUVs rolled smoothly up the long, winding tree-lined driveway, their heavy tires grinding loudly against the pristine white gravel. The sudden sound cut through the soft jazz music and the polite, muted chatter of the brunch guests like a sharp blade. Heads began to turn one by one. Conversations halted mid-sentence as the wealthy neighbors lowered their champagne flutes, their brows furrowing in collective confusion. This was a highly exclusive, gated community where uninvited guests simply did not exist. The vehicles moved with a deliberate, synchronized precision that commanded immediate attention. They did not park in the designated guest area near the front gardens. Instead, they pulled directly onto the expansive circular turnaround right at the base of the main patio steps, blocking the catering vans and asserting physical dominance over the space. My father stared at the vehicles, his face twisting from anger directed at me into a mask of deep, offended bewilderment. He lowered his hand from where he had been pointing at my face and took a step toward the edge of the patio. He clearly thought this was some sort of colossal mistake by a lost delivery service. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the leather folder tucked under my arm, watching the flawless execution of my instructions unfold. My father puffed out his chest and demanded they leave his property. He didn't realize they were there to remove him. The heavy doors of the lead SUV swung open in perfect unison. Evander, the commander of my private security detail, stepped out first. He wore a sharp tactical black suit, an earpiece resting visibly against his jaw, and an expression of unyielding authority. 2 more security professionals exited the rear doors, mirroring his imposing stance. They fanned out across the base of the stone steps, effectively securing the primary exit route from the patio. From the second vehicle, a uniformed local sheriff deputy stepped out into the crisp November air. The sight of the polished silver badge pinned to his chest and the heavy-duty utility belt at his waist sent an immediate, visible shockwave through the crowd of country club elites. The remaining murmurs of conversation instantly died out, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Finally, Talia emerged from the passenger side of the second SUV. My lead property manager looked magnificent. She wore a tailored navy blue pantsuit and carried a thick, official-looking clipboard pressed firmly against her chest. Her posture was rigidly professional, entirely unaffected by the blatant stares of the millionaires gathered on the lawn. She took point, walking purposefully up the wide stone steps toward the patio, flanked closely by the sheriff deputy and Evander. The sheer gravity of their unified approach made the catering staff instinctively step back, clearing a wide path directly to the center of the gathering. Alistair finally found his voice, stepping forward to intercept them with his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of territorial bravado. "Excuse me," my father barked, his deep voice cracking slightly as he tried to project maximum authority. "What on earth do you think you are doing? This is a private residence. We are hosting a private event. You have zero right to drive your vehicles onto this patio. I demand that you turn around and leave my property this instant." Talia did not even blink. She stopped exactly 4 feet away from my father, planting her feet firmly on the expensive stone pavers. She looked him up and down with cold, clinical detachment. Alistair was visibly shaking now, his face flushing a bright, furious red as the humiliation of being challenged in front of his wealthy peers began to set in. Maeve, realizing that a major scene was unfolding, quickly shoved her way through the crowd of guests. She jogged over to stand beside our father, attempting to flash her signature arrogant smile to defuse the tension. "Officers, please," Maeve said smoothly, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "There has obviously been some sort of administrative error here. I am the primary leaseholder of this estate. My name is Maeve, and I manage the wealth portfolio that secures this property. If you have some sort of delivery or service issue, you need to take it around to the service entrance at the back. You are frightening my parents' guests." Talia looked directly at Maeve. She did not lower her voice to accommodate her fragile ego or to spare the feelings of the gossiping neighbors leaning in to listen. She spoke with a loud, clear, and perfectly enunciated tone that carried to the very back of the catering tents. "I am looking for the legal occupants of this property," Talia announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the main house. "I am the senior representative of Apex Holdings LLC, the corporate entity that holds the deed to this entire estate." Maeve's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The blood drained thoroughly from her face, leaving her a sickening shade of pale gray. She took a stumbling step backward, her eyes darting frantically toward the security guards and the armed deputy. She knew that name. She knew exactly what was happening. And the sheer terror of her collapsing reality was written all over her sweating forehead. Talia unclipped a thick stack of watermarked legal documents from her board. She held them up for everyone to see. "As the authorized representative of Apex Holdings, I am here to formally announce the immediate termination of your residential lease agreement. This action is being executed due to critical, prolonged violations of the binding contract signed exactly 24 months ago." My mother let out a loud, high-pitched gasp. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered violently against the stone patio, sending shards flying across the ground, but nobody even looked down. Every single eye was glued to Talia. "What are you talking about?" my father roared, spittle flying from his lips. "We do not have any violations. My daughter pays a fortune to lease this house. She is a premier client. You are out of your mind." Talia did not flinch at his shouting. She simply flipped to the second page of her document and began to read the formal eviction mandate with ruthless precision. "This eviction is being enforced due to extreme and hostile behavior directed toward the property owner," Talia stated clearly, letting the words sink into the silent crowd. "Furthermore, the tenant has committed massive financial delinquency. Specifically, you have failed to render any rent payments for 14 consecutive months. You are currently in default to the sum of tens of thousands of dollars." The guests gasped in unison. The extremely wealthy neighbors who had just spent the entire last hour loudly praising Maeve as a brilliant financial genius now stared at her in horror. Whispers broke out immediately, spreading like wildfire across the patio. Therefore, Talia concluded, slowly lowering the heavy clipboard and staring directly into Maeve's utterly terrified eyes. By the strict legal authority granted under the breach of contract clause, you and your entire family are hereby ordered to vacate these premises immediately. You have exactly 1 hour to carefully gather your essential belongings under the strict supervision of this private security detail. If you are not off this property in 60 minutes, the sheriff deputy will physically place you under arrest for criminal trespassing. Your time starts right now. Do not attempt to resist this lawful order. The echo of Talia's final word hung over the patio like a death sentence. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody dared to breathe. The wealthy neighbors stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between Talia's clipboard and my family. Then, the shock shattered and chaos erupted. Alistair stepped forward, his face twisting into a furious snarl as he turned his wrath onto Maeve. "What is this woman talking about?" he bellowed, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "Tell them this is a massive mistake. Fix this administrative error right now before I call my own lawyers." Beatrix rushed to my father's side, her hands trembling as she smoothed the front of her expensive cashmere sweater. She cast a desperate, pleading look at Mrs. Cressida, attempting to salvage whatever tiny shred of social standing she had left. "It is just a bank glitch, Cressida," Beatrix stammered, her voice pitched high and tight with panic. "You know how these massive corporate entities operate. They mix up routing numbers and suddenly send armed guards to terrorize innocent people. Maeve will straighten this out in 5 minutes. She handles millions of dollars." Maeve looked like she was going to vomit. The perfectly tailored designer blazer she wore suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big for her shrinking frame. She wiped a thick layer of sweat from her forehead, her eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. "Do something," my father roared, shoving Maeve hard on the shoulder. "You are the primary leaseholder. Tell them who you are. Throw them off our land." Maeve stumbled forward from the force of our father's shove. She swallowed hard, forcing a sickeningly fake, incredibly strained smile onto her face as she approached Talia. Desperation overrode her pride. She reached a trembling hand inside her designer bag and pulled out a slim leather-bound checkbook. Her fingers shook violently as she fumbled for a pen. She looked around wildly at the audience of wealthy neighbors, then leaned as close to Talia as the security guard would allow. "Okay, listen to me," Maeve hissed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "I will write you a personal check right now. I will write it for the entire 14 months of back rent. I will include whatever ridiculous late fees your company wants to charge. Just give me a number and I will write the check right this second. Do not do this to me in front of these people, please." She was begging. The golden child, the financial genius, the woman who had stood on my porch just hours earlier threatening to make me homeless, was now pleading for her life. She clicked her pen rapidly, waiting for Talia to give her a figure. Talia looked down at the leather checkbook trembling in Maeve's hands. She did not lower her voice. She did not lean in to accommodate her pathetic request for privacy. Instead, she took a deliberate step to the side, ensuring that she had a clear line of sight to my parents and the entire crowd of breathless, eavesdropping neighbors. "Your personal check is worthless, Maeve," Talia announced, projecting her words so perfectly that they echoed against the stone facade of the mansion. The crowd gasped collectively. My mother grabbed my father's arm to steady herself. "I will not accept a personal check from you because you do not have any money," Talia continued ruthlessly. "We have the complete financial history of your interactions with Apex Holdings. Your checks have bounced consecutively for 14 months due to insufficient funds. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen and overdrawn. You do not manage wealth. You are bankrupt, and you have been living on this estate solely on the unacknowledged charity of the property owner." The silence that followed that declaration was profound. It was the sound of a total social execution. Mrs. Cressida let out a shocked, scandalized squeak and physically took a step away from my mother, as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. The other neighbors immediately followed suit, creating a wide, empty circle of isolation around my parents and my sister. "You're lying," my father screamed, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical pitch. He lunged forward, grabbing Maeve by the lapels of her tailored suit and shaking her violently. "Tell her she is lying, Maeve. Tell these people she is a liar. Show them your accounts." Maeve did not fight back. She dropped the leather checkbook onto the stone patio, the pen clattering loudly against the pavers. She looked at our father with eyes hollowed out by fear and shame. She had nothing left to say. Talia looked at her watch with indifference. "You now have 50 minutes to gather your essential items. I strongly suggest you stop wasting time. The sheriff deputy will escort you into the main house to supervise your packing." My father released Maeve's jacket, staggering backward as if he had been physically struck. His mind scrambled to find any clerical error that could preserve his social standing. "Who is in charge of this ridiculous company?" Alistair demanded, his voice echoing shrilly across the stone patio. "I demand to speak to the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings immediately. Whoever owns this company is going to hear from me. Get your boss on the phone right this second." Talia did not reach for her phone. She simply turned her head and looked directly at me. The sheriff deputy followed her gaze. Evander and the other security professionals turned their attention toward me as well. Slowly, methodically, the entire crowd of wealthy neighbors, caterers, and disgraced family members followed their line of sight. Suddenly, every single pair of eyes on the patio was locked onto me. I tightened my grip on the black leather presentation folder tucked under my arm and took my first step forward. My black heels clicked sharply against the stone pavers. The crowd of country club elites instinctively parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path leading directly to the center of the gathering where my family stood in ruin. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who held total power over everything in her line of sight. My mother watched me approach nervously, clutching her pearl necklace. Confusion warped her features, unable to comprehend why the authority figures invading her brunch were suddenly deferring to her massive disappointment of a daughter. I walked right up to the catered brunch table positioned between my father and the property management team. I stopped, planting my feet firmly on the stone. "You demanded to speak to the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the patio. It was a calm, steady declaration that carried immense weight. I placed the heavy black leather folder squarely in the center of the brunch table, pushing aside a silver platter of pastries to make room. My mother's champagne glass had shattered on the stone patio, but that was nothing compared to the shattering of their entire world. Alistair stared at me, his face caught in a bizarre state of suspended animation. "What are you babbling about, Rowena?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "This is adult business. Stay out of it and go back to the guest house before you make this worse." I did not break eye contact with my father as I reached forward and flipped the leather cover open. I took the thick stack of legal documents and spread them out across the white linen tablecloth for everyone to see. "There is no administrative error," I said, my tone flat and unforgiving. "There is no corporate glitch. My name is Rowena. I am the sole owner, founder, and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, LLC. I bought this entire $5 million estate 2 years ago, entirely in cash, using the profits from the sale of my logistics software company." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Cressida covered her mouth with both hands, staring at the documents displaying my name in bold legal print. My mother let out a strangled sound, staggering backward until she bumped against the stone bar. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly under the weight of the revelation. "You are lying," Alistair whispered, his eyes darting frantically to the papers on the table. "This is impossible. You do not have that kind of money. You are a single mother. You dropped out of college. You are a beggar." I pointed to the heavy watermarked property deed resting next to the crystal champagne flutes. "Read the deed, Alistair," I commanded, dropping the respectful title of father entirely. "Read the articles of incorporation. Read the signature on the commercial lease agreement your beloved daughter signed with my corporate entity. I am not a beggar. I am the landlord." Maeve let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. She sank down onto a nearby patio chair and buried her face in her hands, unable to witness the destruction of her lies. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was currently staring at me as if I were a ghost. For 2 years, I allowed Maeve to pretend she was the wealthy benefactor. I explained clearly, making sure the entire crowd heard every single word. She came to my apartment crying because she was drowning in debt from terrible investments. She begged me to let her sign a fake lease so she could look like a hero to her country club friends. I agreed out of pity, under the strict condition that she actually pay the heavily discounted property taxes. Instead, she stopped paying entirely 14 months ago. Beatrix shook her head rapidly, trying to reject the reality crashing down around her. No, she gasped, her voice trembling violently. Maeve is successful. Maeve takes care of us. You're making this up because you're jealous. Talia stepped forward, tapping her clipboard. The documents on the table are fully legally binding, ma'am, the property manager stated with professional coldness. Rowena is the absolute owner of this estate. Your daughter is a delinquent tenant who is currently facing severe legal action for breach of contract. My father looked down at the property deed. His eyes scanned the legal text reading my full name listed as the sole proprietor. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking frail, old, and utterly defeated. His hands began to shake as the magnitude of his massive mistake finally registered in his brain. The daughter he had mocked, screamed at, and humiliated for 7 years was a self-made multimillionaire. The daughter he worshipped was a bankrupt fraud, and they were all living under my roof. Last night, you sat at my dining room table and told me I was a parasite, I said, bringing my attention back to Alistair. You screamed in my face and called my son a beggar. You allowed Maeve to threaten me with eviction from my own property. I told you that you had 12 hours to leave. You laughed at me. I looked down at my silver watch and then back up at my parents. It is now 12:10 in the afternoon. Your time is officially up. You are trespassing on my private property. I turned to my security team. Please proceed with the eviction protocols immediately. Remove these trespassers from my home. Talia nodded briskly, concluding their pathetic delusion forever. Evander signaled the 2 security professionals near the patio steps. They moved forward instantly, closing the distance to my paralyzed family. There was no aggressive physical contact, just the intimidating presence of professionals enforcing a lawful boundary. Evander instructed my parents and sister to move inside the main house to gather their essential items. He handed my father a stack of thick, black contractor trash bags. The visual impact of handing luxury obsessed Alistair a roll of garbage bags in front of his elite social circle was profoundly devastating. My father stared at the black plastic as if it were poison. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand proper moving boxes or a time extension, but the cold look in Evander's eyes stopped him dead. Defeated, Alistair turned and walked toward the French doors like a condemned man. Maeve followed blindly, her expensive leather loafers scraping against the stone pavers, her body hunched over in total defeat. My mother was the last to move. She looked frantically around the patio, pleading for someone to step forward and intervene. Cressida, my mother cried out, taking a desperate step toward the HOA president. Please, you have to help us make sense of this. You know we are good people. Mrs. Cressida took 3 rapid steps backward, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She quickly pulled out her smartphone and began rapidly texting, her eyes wide with the thrill of possessing the most scandalous gossip of the decade. She turned her head away, her nose wrinkling in disgust, and ignored my mother's pathetic plea. The wealthy suburbanites, who just minutes ago eagerly drank my champagne, now looked at my family like they were strangers. They were already spreading the news across their exclusive social networks. My mother let out a small, broken sob. With her social standing officially destroyed, she turned and fled into the main house, her hands covering her face. I remained on the patio, watching the caterers silently pack up the brunch stations. The party was over. I had zero desire to watch them frantically stuff their designer clothes into plastic trash bags. I let my security team handle the degrading process. For the next 50 minutes, I stood near the edge of the lake, listening to the soft rippling of the water, enjoying the peace of my property. Exactly 50 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the mansion swung wide open. The walk of shame began. My father, the man who had always demanded total submission, was struggling to carry 3 bulging black garbage bags over his shoulders. His face was a mask of pure humiliation. Maeve followed close behind, dragging 2 plastic bags that clinked loudly with the sound of her luxury watches thrown haphazardly inside. My mother walked at the rear, weeping openly, her mascara running down her cheeks. They loaded their pathetic black bags into Maeve's least luxury sedan. The irony was striking. They were packing garbage bags into a car she did not even own, preparing to drive away from a house she had pretended to lease. The security vehicles pulled up close behind them, ready to escort them off the premises and ensure they did not return. As Maeve started the engine, my father rolled down the passenger side window. He looked across the vast front lawn, his eyes searching until they found me near the edge of the driveway. He did not yell or make threats. He just stared at me with a look of profound, devastating realization. He finally understood he had backed the wrong child. He had poured his entire life's pride and love into a daughter who had ruined him, while treating the daughter who actually held all the power like dirt. I did not wave or smile. I simply stood my ground and watched as Maeve put the car in drive. The leased sedan rolled slowly down the long gravel driveway, flanked tightly by the 2 black security SUVs. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open to let them out, then closed firmly behind them with a loud, definitive metallic clang. The estate was finally quiet. The toxic infection that had plagued my property for 2 years was removed. They drove off to a cheap, roach-infested motel. They thought the humiliation was over. But my lawyer was about to drop the real bomb. Several days passed. The bitter chill of November settled firmly over the city, but inside the guest house, my life was warmer and more peaceful than it had been in years. The digital fallout from the eviction was swift and brutal. My parents were blacklisted from their country club, their phone numbers blocked by every single wealthy neighbor they had spent a decade trying to impress. They were living in a dingy, dilapidated roadside motel, drowning in the reality of their own arrogance. But Maeve, fueled by delusion and a desperate need to reclaim her narrative, decided to take a more aggressive route. She managed to find a discount, predatory lawyer willing to take on an entirely baseless lawsuit. Gideon called me to explain that Maeve was officially suing Apex Holdings LLC, and me personally, for $10 million. She claimed that despite the written lease agreement, she had established sweat equity in the estate by coordinating landscaping and maintenance. She also demanded a massive payout for the severe emotional distress and public humiliation caused by the sudden eviction, arguing that the 12-hour notice was illegal and intentionally designed to destroy her professional reputation. She was broke, living in a motel, and yet she still thought she could bully me into submission. She genuinely believed that if she threw enough legal threats in my direction, I would panic and offer her a quiet, lucrative settlement just to make the headache go away. I did not panic. I told Gideon to schedule a mediation meeting immediately, and I told him to bring the forensic audit. The mediation took place at the prestigious downtown offices of my legal team. It was a neutral, heavily controlled environment featuring pristine white marble floors and sweeping views of the city skyline. Gideon and I walked into the primary executive conference room. On the far side of the long, polished mahogany table sat my father, my mother, and my sister, flanked by a nervous-looking attorney who clearly realized he was out of his depth. Maeve leaned back in her leather chair, crossing her arms over her chest. A smug, victorious smirk played across her lips. She believed she had the upper hand. Gideon and I sat down opposite them. Gideon placed a thick, dark red leather folder on the table directly in front of him. He did not open it. He simply let it rest there. Maeve's lawyer cleared his throat nervously and began outlining their ridiculous demands, citing sweat equity and emotional trauma. He offered a swift settlement if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement and hand over the $10 million. I did not flinch. I just watched Maeve's face radiating pure greed. Gideon folded his hands together. "Your demands are without merit," Gideon stated, his voice ringing with corporate authority. "Your client signed a commercial lease that explicitly prohibits claims of sweat equity. The eviction was executed flawlessly within the boundaries of local law. We have already filed a motion to dismiss your frivolous lawsuit with prejudice." Maeve leaned forward, dropping her pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. "You can throw around all the legal threats you want, Rowena," Maeve spat, her voice laced with venom. "You do not want a messy, dragged-out public court battle. Pay the money and I will let you go back to your pathetic, lonely life." Alistair nodded in vigorous agreement. "Listen to your sister, Rowena. She is offering you a generous way out of this nightmare you created. You threw your own parents into a disgusting motel. Pay her what she is asking for and maybe we can put this disgraceful chapter behind us." I looked at my father, feeling a profound sense of pity for his deep, blinding ignorance. He was fiercely defending the exact person who had destroyed his entire future. "I am not going to pay you a single dime, Maeve," I said quietly. "But we are going to discuss your professional reputation." I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of the dark red leather folder resting in front of Gideon. I slowly slid the heavy folder across the smooth mahogany table. It glided silently, coming to a complete stop directly in front of my father. Alistair looked down at the folder, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. "Open it," I commanded. My father reached out with thick fingers and flipped the leather cover open. The very first page was a summary document printed on the official letterhead of an elite forensic accounting firm. The room fell so incredibly quiet that I could hear the faint, ragged sound of Maeve breathing. The false confidence on her face began to crack. It took exactly 30 seconds for the devastating reality to hit my father. I watched the color drain from Alistair's face. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree, darting frantically back and forth across the crisp white paper. His hands began to shake violently. "Alistair, what is it?" Beatrix whispered, leaning over his shoulder. My father dropped the thick stack of papers onto the table. The sharp slap echoed like a gunshot. He stared at the documents, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He pointed a shaking finger at the signature line on the top page. "That is not my signature," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking into a high, fragile pitch. He looked up at Maeve, his face twisted in a mask of pure agony. "You forged my name. You stole my retirement fund. You took everything I worked my entire life to build." Beatrix snatched the documents from the table, shoving her reading glasses onto her face. Her eyes darted across the columns of red numbers and the clear proof of massive, systematic theft. She let out a low, guttural gasp. "Maeve, tell me this is a lie. Tell me you did not empty our accounts to pay for your leased cars." Maeve was backed into a corner with nowhere left to hide. The undeniable proof was sitting right in front of her. Her discount lawyer took one look at the documents detailing federal wire fraud, stood up without saying a word, packed his briefcase, and walked straight out of the conference room. He abandoned his client on the spot. Maeve gripped the edge of the table. Instead of apologizing, she chose to attack the very people she had just robbed. "What did you expect me to do?" Maeve shouted, her face red with nervous sweat. "You expected perfection. You demanded the lifestyle of millionaires, and I was drowning trying to give it to you. You had all that money sitting in retirement accounts doing nothing. You pushed me into this." "Doing nothing?" my father roared, slamming his fist down on the table. "That was our entire future. We trusted you. We handed you our portfolio because you swore you were a genius. You ruined us, Maeve. We are bankrupt. We have nothing left." Penniless, homeless, and betrayed by their golden child, they slowly turned to look at the only person left in the room who had money. They turned to me. The poetic justice of the moment was profound, but I felt zero joy in witnessing it. I just felt a deep, abiding disgust for the total moral bankruptcy of the people sitting across from me. Beatrix slowly lowered the forensic documents onto the table. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely release the paper. She looked at Alistair, seeing her own terror reflected in his eyes. They finally understood the grim reality of their situation. Their country club friends had blocked their phone numbers. The golden child was a criminal. The only person standing in the room who possessed the means to save them was the exact same daughter they had mercilessly abused and humiliated for decades. My mother slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. The arrogant, condescending matriarch was gone. In her place sat a terrified, broken woman who had just realized she was at the mercy of her favorite scapegoat. Her eyes filled with real, desperate tears. They spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She reached her shaking hands across the wide mahogany table, palms turned upward in a pathetic gesture of submission. "Rowena, please," Beatrix wept, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. "Please, you have to help us. We have nowhere to go. We are sleeping in a filthy motel room. We do not have money for food. Your sister has taken everything. We are ruined. You are our daughter. You are a millionaire. Please, just let us move back into the guest house." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the armrest of my chair. I watched the woman who had loudly announced to her friends that I was a struggling failure now plead for my charity. "We will be quiet," my father chimed in, his voice stripped of all its former booming authority. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes. "We will not bother you, Rowena. We can help you maintain the property. We can do the landscaping. We can clean. Just please do not leave us out on the street. We are your parents. You cannot abandon your own flesh and blood." When appealing to my sense of familial duty did not immediately work, my mother shifted her tactics. She reached for the ultimate trump card, the exact manipulation tactic I knew she would eventually try to use against me. "Think about Ronan," Beatrix pleaded, wiping her running mascara with the back of her hand. "Ronan loves us. He needs his grandparents in his life. You cannot take a boy away from his family. A child needs a village to raise him. We can be that village, Rowena. We can watch him while you work. We just made a terrible mistake trusting your sister. Please find it in your heart to forgive us for Ronan's sake." I stared at her, feeling a cold, solid wall of resolve settle firmly in my chest. The mere fact that she dared to use my sweet, innocent son as a bargaining chip to secure free housing filled me with a quiet, lethal anger. They did not care about Ronan. They never cared about him. They only cared about their own comfort and survival. I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes, making sure she saw the finality in my gaze. "You do not get to use my son to save yourself," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Every single word was a precisely calibrated strike. "If you cared about Ronan, you would not have sat at my dining table and allowed my father to scream in my face and call us beggars in front of him. You would not have smirked while Maeve threatened to throw a 7-year-old boy out into the freezing cold. You do not want to be a grandmother. You just want a free roof over your head because your golden child turned out to be a federal criminal." Beatrix flinched violently, pulling her hands back across the table as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. "You called me a parasite," I continued, shifting my gaze to my father. "You told your wealthy friends that I was a pathetic disappointment. Now you are sitting here begging to live in my guest house and offering to do my landscaping. The hypocrisy is staggering. You built your entire identity on the illusion of wealth and status. You chose the daughter who fed you those comfortable lies. You chose to tear me down simply because my authentic life did not match your country club aesthetic." "We were wrong, Rowena," Alistair pleaded, his voice cracking. "We see the truth now." "Seeing the truth when you have zero other options is not a revelation, Alistair. It is just basic survival," I replied coldly. "You do not respect me. You only respect my bank account. And I refuse to let my son grow up around people who measure human worth by the brand of their suit. Family is not built on blood. Family is built on mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support. You have never provided any of those things to me." I pushed my chair back and stood up. I buttoned my tailored charcoal blazer with calm, deliberate movements. "My legal team will be forwarding the full forensic audit to the federal authorities," I announced, glancing briefly at Maeve, who was staring blankly at the floor in total shock. "What you did with their retirement accounts is wire fraud. I suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney. As for you two," I said, looking down at my parents one last time, You are completely cut off. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my property gates. Do not ever attempt to contact my son. If you violate these boundaries, my security team will have you arrested for trespassing. I turned to my corporate attorney. Wrap this up, Gideon. We are entirely finished here. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back at their weeping faces or listen to their final pathetic apologies. I turned my back on the toxic wreckage of my biological family and walked straight out of the conference room. The heavy frosted glass doors closed firmly behind me, severing the connection forever. I walked toward the private elevator, feeling a massive, invisible weight vanish from my shoulders. I was finally, truly free. 3 months later, the bitter chill of winter had melted away, replaced by the warm, vibrant air of an early spring evening. The massive $5 million estate was entirely transformed. I had spent the last 90 days methodically erasing every trace of my parents' superficial, pretentious aesthetic from the main house. The heavy velvet drapes were gone, replaced by light linen panels that let the sunshine pour in. The stiff antique furniture had been donated, replaced by plush, welcoming modern seating designed for actual human comfort. The house no longer felt like a sterile museum. It felt like a real home. The vast set of French doors leading out to the stone patio were thrown wide open. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, but the atmosphere could not have been more different from that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The table was covered in bright wildflowers and mismatched colorful ceramic plates. The air was filled with the rich scent of a massive home-cooked Italian feast that we had all spent the afternoon preparing together. There were no arrogant wealth managers or judgmental suburban socialites in my home tonight. I was surrounded by genuine, supportive friends who felt like true family. Gideon was sitting near the center of the table, laughing loudly at a joke being told by Talia. Lauren, my loyal nanny, was sitting next to them, helping serve a massive bowl of roasted garlic pasta. I looked down toward the far end of the long dining table. Ronan was sitting there, his face smeared with tomato sauce, giggling uncontrollably as Gideon performed a ridiculous magic trick with a breadstick. My son was safe. He was surrounded by adults who valued kindness, honesty, and hard work. He would never have to endure the cruel comparisons or the toxic status chasing that had poisoned my own childhood. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, refreshing sip. I had recently read a brief news update online regarding my former family. Maeve was currently facing a lengthy federal indictment for her financial crimes. Alistair and Beatrix were renting a tiny, cramped apartment in a dreary industrial town miles away, entirely alienated from everyone they used to know. They were trapped in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. But that dark, toxic world had zero bearing on my life anymore. I set my glass down on the table and smiled as Ronan ran over to hug my waist, asking if it was time for dessert yet. I pulled my son close. The toxic roots of my past had been permanently severed. My foundation was solid. My boundaries were impenetrable. And my future was entirely my own. Was I too harsh in letting them lose absolutely everything, or did they get exactly the karma they deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries, surviving betrayal, and reclaiming your peace. Remember, you always hold the pen to your own life story.